I watched Susan Patterson march up my driveway like she owned the place, her perfectly coiffed blonde hair bouncing with each aggressive step, and I knew my peaceful Saturday morning was about to go straight to hell. My name is Ryan Calloway, and I had been living in Pinewood Valley, Colorado for exactly 18 months when the HOA decided to make my life their personal mission. I had moved here after my divorce, buying a modest 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of this upscale neighborhood, thinking the mountain views and quiet streets would help me rebuild my life. What I did not anticipate was the iron-fisted rule of Susan Patterson and her band of busybody HOA board members who seemed to have nothing better to do than measure the height of everyone's grass and document the exact shade of beige on every house. "Ryan," Susan called out, waving a manila folder above her head like it was a court summons. "We need to talk." I set down my coffee mug on the porch railing and braced myself. I had learned quickly that conversations with Susan were never actually conversations. They were lectures, demands wrapped in a thin veneer of neighborly concern that fooled absolutely nobody. "Morning, Susan," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "What can I do for you?" She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, her eyes scanning my property with the intensity of a building inspector looking for code violations. Her gaze landed exactly where I knew it would, on the 2 large propane tanks I had installed last month next to my detached garage. "Those," she said, pointing at the tanks with a manicured fingernail painted the color of dried blood, "those need to go, immediately." I took a slow sip of my coffee, buying myself a moment to process this absurd demand. "Excuse me, the propane tanks. They are in violation of our community standards. Section 12, subsection 4 of the HOA covenant states that all utility equipment must be concealed from street view or properly screened. Those eyesores are neither." I looked at my tanks, which were painted white to match my house and positioned on the side of my property, barely visible from the street. "Susan, those tanks are on my property, set back from the road, and they are necessary. The natural gas line does not extend to this part of the neighborhood, as you well know. I need propane for my heating, hot water, and cooking." "That is not my problem," she snapped, opening her folder and pulling out a printed document. "This is your official notice of violation. You have 30 days to remove them or face daily fines of $50 until compliance is achieved." My jaw tightened. "You cannot be serious. It is November. We are heading into winter. Those tanks are literally keeping my house warm and functional." "Then I suggest you find an alternative solution. Many of your neighbors manage just fine with electric heating." She thrust the paper toward me. 30 days, Ryan. The board voted unanimously." I descended the steps and took the notice from her hand, scanning the official HOA letterhead and the list of supposed violations. "This is ridiculous. Half the houses in this neighborhood have utility equipment visible. Tom Martinez has an AC unit right in his front yard. The Hendersons have a utility box that is bright green and impossible to miss." "Those are different circumstances," Susan said, her lips pursing into a thin line. How are they different? They just are. The board has made its decision." She turned to leave, then paused and looked back at me. "And Ryan, I would strongly suggest you comply. We have ways of making life very difficult for non-cooperative residents." As I watched her walk away, her heels clicking against the asphalt with militaristic precision, I felt anger bubble up in my chest. This was not about community standards or property values. This was about power. Susan Patterson had been the HOA president for 7 years, and from what I had gathered talking to other neighbors, she ruled Pinewood Valley like her personal fiefdom. Those who fell in line got to live in peace. Those who questioned her authority faced an endless barrage of violation notices, fines, and harassment. I went back inside and immediately called my real estate attorney, Marcus Chen, who I had kept on retainer specifically because I knew dealing with this HOA was going to be a nightmare. Marcus had warned me before I bought the house that Pinewood Valley's HOA was notorious for being aggressive, but I had brushed off his concerns, thinking I could handle a few petty rules. "They want you to remove your propane tanks," Marcus repeated after I explained the situation. "In November. Going into a Colorado winter. That is what the notice says. 30 days or daily fines." I heard papers rustling on his end. "Let me look at your covenant documents. Did you get approval before installing the tanks?" I submitted an application to the Architectural Review Committee back in September. They never responded, so per the covenant, that counts as automatic approval after 45 days of silence. "Good. You documented everything. Every email, every certified letter, every attempt to contact them. I learned my lesson after they tried to fine me for repainting my shutters the wrong shade of brown." Marcus chuckled. "All right, sit tight. Do not remove those tanks. I will draft a response citing the automatic approval clause and the unreasonable nature of the demand. We will also point out that removing essential utility equipment in winter could constitute a habitability issue." I hung up feeling slightly better, but the sense of dread lingered. I had been through enough battles with the HOA to know that legal correctness did not always translate to practical victory. Susan and her board had deep pockets, funded by the monthly HOA dues from over 300 homes in Pinewood Valley. They could drag out legal fights indefinitely, racking up fines and legal fees that would bury me even if I eventually won. The next 2 weeks were relatively quiet, which should have been my first warning sign. Marcus sent his response letter, firmly but professionally telling the HOA to pound sand. I continued my life as normal, going to my job as a senior software engineer at a tech company in Denver, coming home to my quiet house, and enjoying the warmth provided by my perfectly legal propane tanks. Then the weather reports started getting serious. A massive winter storm was brewing over the Rockies, the kind that meteorologists talked about with barely concealed excitement. The National Weather Service issued warnings for heavy snow, high winds, and dangerous cold. Predictions ranged from 18 inches to 3 feet of snow, with wind chills plunging below zero. Hardware stores sold out of generators, salt, and emergency supplies within hours. I spent that Thursday afternoon preparing. I filled my propane tanks to maximum capacity, stocked up on food and water, charged every battery and device I owned, and made sure my snow blower was in working order. My house was old but solid, built in the 1970s with good bones and real insulation. With full propane tanks, I could ride out a week-long siege without breaking a sweat. The storm hit on Friday night with a vengeance. Snow fell so thick and fast that visibility dropped to near zero within the first hour. Wind howled around my house, rattling windows and piling drifts against my garage door. I sat in my living room, warm and comfortable, watching the blizzard rage outside while my propane furnace hummed quietly in the basement. Saturday morning arrived gray and brutal. The snow had not stopped, and according to the news, it was not going to stop until Sunday afternoon at the earliest. I looked out my window at a transformed world, everything buried under feet of pristine white powder. Trees bowed under the weight, power lines sagged dangerously low, and the street was completely impassable. My phone rang at 9 in the morning. It was my neighbor, Gary Hughes, who lived 2 houses down. Ryan, hey, are you doing okay over there? He asked, his voice tight with stress. Yeah, I am good. Power is still on, heat is working fine. Power is out, been out since about 4 this morning. But that is not why I am calling. He paused. Have you heard what happened to the main natural gas line? My stomach dropped. No, what happened? It ruptured. About 2 miles east of here, right where the line comes up the mountain. Something about the ground shifting or a tree falling on the infrastructure. I do not know the details. Point is, natural gas service is out for the entire neighborhood. The gas company says they cannot even get crews out to assess the damage until the roads are clear, which could be days. I sat down heavily on my couch. Jesus, so everyone on natural gas has no heat. No heat, no hot water, no stove if they have gas cooking. It is a disaster, Ryan. My wife and I are huddled in the bedroom with every blanket we own. We tried to use the fireplace, but we are going through wood way too fast, and we only have electric baseboard heaters in the other rooms, which do not work without power. You want to come over here? I have heat, hot water, I can make you both a hot meal. Really? Oh man, Ryan, that would be incredible. Let me talk to Linda. 20 minutes later, Gary and Linda were at my door, bundled in so many layers they could barely move. I ushered them inside, and Linda actually started crying when the warm air hit her face. I did not think I would ever feel warm again, she said, pulling off her hat and gloves. I made them coffee and breakfast while they thawed out in my living room. As we ate, my phone started buzzing with calls and texts. Other neighbors were realizing that I still had heat and hot water, and word was spreading fast. By noon, I had 8 people in my house, all grateful for the warmth and the hot food. That is when Susan Patterson called. Ryan, she said, her voice lacking its usual imperious tone. This is Susan. I am calling because the HOA board is organizing a wellness check on all residents given the current emergency situation. That is very thoughtful, I said, unable to keep the sarcasm completely out of my voice. Yes, well, we take the safety of our community very seriously. She paused, and I heard wind howling in the background. I understand you have propane heat. Is that correct? It is. Why? Another pause. My house is on natural gas. The line is down. I have no heat, no hot water. The power is also out in my section of the neighborhood. I waited, letting the silence stretch out. I was wondering, she continued, and I could hear how much it pained her to say the words, if perhaps the HOA could arrange to use your house as a temporary warming center for affected residents. The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with a knife. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Susan. You want to use my house, the one with the propane tanks you demanded I remove, as an emergency shelter. This is an extraordinary situation, Ryan. Personal disputes need to be set aside for the good of the community. Personal disputes. I felt my temper rising. You threatened to fine me $50 a day for keeping the very equipment that is now the only reason I have heat. You called my propane tanks eyesores. You said the board voted unanimously to force me to remove them. We can discuss that later. Right now, people are freezing. You are right, people are freezing. That is why I already have 8 of my neighbors here warming up. But let me be very clear about something, Susan. This is not an HOA warming center. This is my private residence, and I am choosing out of the kindness of my heart and basic human decency to help my neighbors. The HOA, and by extension you, have no authority here. That is a very selfish attitude, Ryan. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to coordinate emergency response. Then, I suggest you coordinate with the county emergency services like you are supposed to. My door is open to any neighbor who needs help. but it is not open to the organization that tried to force me to disable my heating system right before winter. I hung up before she could respond. Linda and Gary, who had heard my side of the conversation, looked at me with wide eyes. "Was that Susan Patterson?" Linda asked. "It was." Gary whistled low. "She is not going to let that go." "I do not care. I am done playing nice with that woman and her board of petty tyrants." But Gary was right. Susan was not going to let it go. Sunday morning, the snow finally stopped. The neighborhood was buried under 2.5 feet of powder, with drifts reaching 6 feet in places. The sky cleared to a brilliant blue, the temperature dropped to 8 degrees, and the wind continued to howl. It was stunningly beautiful and absolutely lethal for anyone without adequate shelter. My house had become a revolving door of neighbors seeking warmth, hot drinks, and phone charging. I had gone through 3 pots of coffee and 2 batches of soup, and my guest bathroom had seen more use in 2 days than in the previous 18 months. I did not mind. These were good people who had always been kind to me, and seeing them safe and warm made the chaos worthwhile. At around 10 in the morning, there was a heavy knock on my door. I opened it to find Susan Patterson standing on my porch, flanked by 2 other HOA board members I recognized: Donald Marsh, the treasurer, and Patricia Vance, the secretary. All 3 looked cold, miserable, and desperate. "Ryan," Susan began, her voice strained, "we need to come inside and talk. My house is warm. You can come in for that reason alone, but if you are here to lecture me or make demands, you can turn around and leave." They exchanged glances, and I could see Susan struggling with her pride. Finally, she nodded. "We just want to talk." I let them in. The contrast between their haggard appearance and the comfort of my living room was stark. Patricia's lips had a bluish tint, and Donald's hands were shaking as he pulled off his gloves. "Coffee," I offered. All 3 nodded gratefully. I poured them cups and waited while they wrapped their hands around the warm mugs and took long, desperate sips. "The situation is worse than we thought," Donald finally said. "The gas company confirmed that repairs to the main line will take at least a week, maybe longer. They have to bring in specialized equipment, and with the roads in their current condition, nothing is moving. The power company is saying 3 to 5 days before they can restore electricity to the affected sections," Patricia added. "Some of the main transmission lines are down." Susan set down her mug and looked at me directly. "Ryan, I am here to formally apologize for the propane tank violation notice. It was inappropriate and, given current circumstances, potentially dangerous. The board is prepared to withdraw the violation and issue a letter stating that your tanks are approved and in compliance with all HOA regulations." I leaned back against my kitchen counter and crossed my arms. "That is nice, but forgive me for being skeptical about the timing." "I know," Susan said, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked genuinely humbled. "I know how this looks, but please understand we have over 100 residents without heat or power right now. Some of them are elderly, some have small children. We need a coordinated response, and your house is the best option for a warming center." "Why my house specifically? There must be other homes with heat. 3 other houses in the development have propane systems," Donald said. "The Mitchells are in Florida for the winter. The Kowalskis' house is too small to accommodate more than a few people, and the Talbots already evacuated to a hotel in Denver before the roads closed. That leaves you." I considered this. Despite my anger at the HOA, I was not cruel. People were genuinely suffering, and I had the means to help. But I also was not going to let Susan and her board off the hook that easily. "Here is what is going to happen," I said slowly. "Yes, my house can serve as a warming center. People can come here to get warm, charge phones, get hot drinks and basic meals, but there are conditions. Susan stiffened. What conditions? First, the violation notice is not just withdrawn. It is expunged from my record entirely, with a written apology from the board acknowledging it should never have been issued. Second, the board issues a new policy stating that propane systems are explicitly allowed and encouraged for homes not serviced by natural gas. Third, I wanted in writing that the HOA will cover my increased propane costs, food expenses, and utility expenses incurred during this emergency. That is extortion, Patricia said sharply. No, that is fairness. You try to take away the very thing that is now saving people's lives. You do not get to benefit from it without acknowledging you were wrong. Take it or leave it. Donald and Patricia looked at Susan, who had turned an interesting shade of red. I could see the war happening behind her eyes, pride battling with necessity. Necessity won. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. I will draft the documents this afternoon. Good, then spread the word. Anyone who needs warmth is welcome between 8 in the morning and 8 at night. I am not running a hotel, so no overnight stays unless it is a genuine emergency. People need to bring their own food if possible, though I will provide hot water for coffee, tea, and instant meals. And one more thing. What? Susan asked warily. You three are going to help. If my house is serving the community, then the community leadership is going to do the actual work. You will take shifts, help serve food, manage the flow of people, and generally make yourselves useful. Deal. The look on Susan's face was priceless, but she nodded. Deal. Over the next 4 days, my house transformed into a bustling community center. At any given time, there were 15 to 20 people warming up, charging devices, or just escaping the brutal cold of their powerless homes. Susan, Donald, and Patricia kept their word, showing up daily to help manage the chaos. I will give them credit. Once they committed, they worked hard. Susan turned out to be surprisingly efficient at organizing shifts and managing supplies. I also got to know my neighbors in a way that would never have happened under normal circumstances. I learned that Gary was a retired firefighter with incredible stories from his career. Linda was an ICU nurse who gave everyone impromptu health checks to make sure no one was developing hypothermia or frostbite. The elderly couple from 3 doors down, Robert and Martha, had been married for 53 years and still held hands everywhere they went. On Tuesday afternoon, the power came back on for most of the neighborhood. People cheered when their lights flickered to life. But the natural gas line was still down, which meant heat and hot water were still out for everyone on gas service. Wednesday brought fresh challenges. A pipe had burst in the Hendersons' house, flooding their basement. The Martinses discovered their furnace had been damaged when they tried to restart it, something about the sudden loss of gas pressure causing a valve failure. Insurance companies were overwhelmed with claims, contractors were booked solid, and everyone's stress levels were reaching critical points. Through it all, my propane tanks chugged along reliably, keeping my house warm and functional. Each time I looked at them, I thought about Susan's violation notice and how close I had come to actually complying. If I had removed them, if I had let the HOA bully me into getting rid of my heat source, I would be just as frozen and desperate as everyone else. Thursday morning, the news reported that the gas company had finally reached the rupture site and was beginning repairs. Estimates for restoration ranged from 24 to 48 hours. The worst was almost over. Susan showed up at noon with a manila envelope. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her designer clothes replaced with practical fleece and jeans. The crisis had stripped away her veneer of untouchable authority, revealing someone who was simply tired and overwhelmed. "The documents you requested," she said, handing me the envelope. "Everything you asked for. The violation is expunged, the apology is written, the new policy is drafted and will be presented to the full membership at next month's meeting, and the reimbursement check for your expenses." I opened the envelope and reviewed the papers. Everything was in order, professionally written and legally binding. The check was generous, more than covering my actual costs. "Thank you," I said. "I know this was not easy for you," she laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Easy? Nothing about this week has been easy. But you were right, Ryan. About the tanks, about the violation notice, about all of it. I let my need to control everything cloud my judgment. I could have killed someone with that policy. You did not know a storm like this was coming. I should have considered the possibility. That is what leadership is supposed to do. Think about worst-case scenarios and make sure people are protected." She looked around my living room, where several neighbors were gathered watching the news. "You did not have to help everyone like this. After how we treated you, you could have said no and been completely justified." "I could have, but that would have made me just as petty as I accused you of being." She winced but nodded. "Fair enough." She extended her hand. "Thank you, Ryan, genuinely. You saved lives this week." I shook her hand. "You are welcome." Friday afternoon, the natural gas service was restored. I was in my kitchen making yet another pot of coffee when I heard cheers from several houses down the street. The gas was flowing again, furnaces were firing up, and normalcy was returning to Pinewood Valley. The flow of neighbors to my house slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely by evening. My home felt suddenly empty and quiet after days of constant activity. I walked through the rooms, picking up forgotten phone chargers and stray coffee mugs, and felt a strange sense of loss. The emergency had forced everyone to come together, to rely on each other, and now that it was over, we would probably drift back into our separate lives. Saturday brought the insurance adjusters, plumbers, and contractors. The neighborhood buzzed with activity as people assessed damage and began repairs. I spent the day deep cleaning my house and restocking my propane tanks, which had been depleted by nearly 80% during the emergency. Sunday evening, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find a delegation of neighbors: Gary and Linda, Robert and Martha, the Hendersons, the Martineses, and at least a dozen others. They were holding covered dishes, bottles of wine, and bags of groceries. "What is this?" I asked. "A thank you," Gary said. "You opened your home to us when we needed it most. The least we can do is feed you a proper meal." They filed into my house, and within minutes my kitchen was full of the best potluck dinner I had ever seen. Homemade lasagna, roasted chicken, fresh bread, salads, desserts, and enough wine to stock a restaurant. We ate and talked and laughed, swapping stories from the storm and making jokes about the great propane tank crisis of last month. Susan arrived near the end of the evening carrying a bottle of expensive bourbon. "I heard there was a party," she said hesitantly. Linda, of all people, waved her in. "Get in here. You helped run the warming center. You are part of this too." Susan looked genuinely touched. She joined our group, and over bourbon, she told stories about her early days as HOA president, before she had let the power go to her head. She had started with good intentions, wanting to maintain property values and create a safe, beautiful community. But somewhere along the way, it had become about control rather than service. "I am going to do better," she said, slightly tipsy and more honest than I had ever seen her. "This storm was a wake-up call. We need to focus on actual safety and community building, not just enforcing arbitrary rules." "We will hold you to that," Gary said with a smile. The party wound down around midnight. As the last neighbors filed out, thanking me again and promising to stay in touch, I stood on my porch and looked at my propane tanks gleaming white in the moonlight. Those two simple cylinders of compressed gas had become the most important structures in the entire neighborhood for a week. They had kept people warm, prevented injuries, possibly even saved lives, and the HOA had wanted them gone. Monday morning, I returned to work remotely, taking video calls from my home office. My boss asked about the storm, and I gave him a brief rundown. He laughed when I told him about the HOA situation. So they tried to make you remove the only heat source that worked during the emergency. Basically, yes. That is the most HOA story I have ever heard. Those organizations attract a special kind of person. He was not wrong, but I had also seen another side during the crisis. People could change when circumstances forced them to see beyond their own small concerns. Susan was still imperious and controlling, but she was making an effort to be better. The community had come together in a way that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Something good had come from the disaster. 2 weeks later, I attended my first HOA meeting in months. The community room was packed, which was unusual. Normally, these meetings drew maybe 15 people. Tonight, there were over 100 residents crammed into the space. Susan called the meeting to order and immediately addressed the storm response. She gave credit where it was due, publicly thanking me and several other neighbors who had helped during the emergency. Then she presented the new propane policy for a vote. This policy explicitly allows and encourages propane systems for any residents not serviced by natural gas lines, she read. It also creates an emergency preparedness committee to assess our community's resilience and make recommendations for future disaster planning. All in favor. The vote was unanimous. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to ask about propane system installation. The storm had convinced them that depending solely on natural gas was too risky. I gave them the contact information for my propane company and offered to answer any questions about the process. As I was leaving, Donald Marsh caught up with me. "Ryan, the board is looking to fill a vacant seat. We would like you to consider joining." I stopped walking. "You want me on the HOA board? We need someone who will ask hard questions and push back when we get too caught up in petty enforcement. You proved you can lead during a crisis. Plus, half the neighborhood already trusts you more than they trust us." He smiled ruefully. "I know we have not given you many reasons to say yes, but think about it." I promised I would, though I was not sure how I felt about joining the organization that had caused me so much frustration. But maybe that was exactly why I should do it. Change from within and all that. December rolled into January, bringing more snow but nothing as dramatic as the Thanksgiving storm. My propane tanks became a regular sight in the neighborhood as 4 more houses installed their own systems. Susan kept her word about reforming the HOA, focusing enforcement on actual safety issues rather than aesthetic nitpicking. She still had her moments of control freak behavior, but she caught herself more often now, and the board had gotten better about checking her authority. I eventually agreed to join the board, filling the vacant seat in February. My first act was to propose a complete review of the covenant restrictions, identifying which rules served legitimate purposes and which were simply outdated or overly restrictive. It was tedious work, but important. One evening in March, I was reviewing proposed amendments to the community documents when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Susan holding a bottle of wine and looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "Can I come in? Not as HOA president, just as a neighbor." I let her in and poured us both glasses. We sat in my living room and she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," she said. "A real one, not just the legal document I drafted during the storm. When you moved here, I saw you as a threat. You were single, successful, did not care about the social hierarchy. You did not ask for permission before doing things. That threatened my control over the community, so I targeted you. The propane tanks were just an excuse." I had suspected as much, but hearing her admit it was surprising. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I have been doing a lot of thinking since the storm, about why I became so obsessed with controlling everything, about what I was really afraid of." She took a sip of wine. "My husband left me 6 years ago, just walked out one day. I threw myself into the HOA because it was something I could control when my personal life had fallen apart, but I took it too far. I became the thing I hated, the petty tyrant who makes everyone miserable." "You are working on it," I said. "That counts for something." "Maybe. I just wanted you to know that the propane tank thing was never about the tanks. It was about me being threatened by someone who did not need my approval." She laughed. "And then those same tanks ended up saving the neighborhood. The universe has a sense of humor. It really does." We talked for another hour, and for the first time, I saw Susan as a complete person rather than just an obstacle. She was flawed, insecure, and trying to do better, just like everyone else. Spring came to Pinewood Valley with its usual dramatic flair, melting snow revealing buried treasures and forgotten lawn furniture. The neighborhood came back to life. Gardens were planted, and people spent their evenings walking the now clear streets. The Emergency Preparedness Committee, which I co-chaired with Gary, presented its findings in April. We recommended that the HOA maintain an emergency fund specifically for disaster response, establish communication protocols for emergencies, and create a neighborhood resource database identifying who had generators, propane systems, medical training, and other useful skills or equipment. All recommendations were approved. In May, the gas company completed a major upgrade to the natural gas infrastructure, including redundant lines and improved safety systems. The utility representative who presented at our HOA meeting specifically mentioned that the Thanksgiving storm had prompted a statewide review of gas system resilience in mountain communities. "Your neighborhood's experience became a case study," he said. "The fact that you had residents with alternative heating sources prevented what could have been a major disaster with injuries or even fatalities." After the meeting, several neighbors made a point of telling me they were glad I had ignored the original violation notice. One woman, Janet Williams, pulled me aside. "You know, I was at the board meeting when they voted to make you remove your tanks," she said quietly. "I voted against it. I was the only one who did. Susan convinced the others it was about property values, but I knew it was personal. I should have fought harder. You voted your conscience. That is all anyone can do. I could have done more. I could have gone public with my opposition or resigned in protest. I chose the easy path of going along to get along. I am sorry for that." Her honesty was refreshing, and it reminded me that organizations were just collections of individuals, each making choices about what they would accept and what they would fight against. It was easy to blame the HOA as a faceless entity, but it was really just Susan, Donald, Patricia, Janet, and others making decisions that affected everyone. When good people stayed silent, bad policies flourished. By summer, the propane tank controversy had become neighborhood legend. New residents would hear the story and usually respond with some version of, "That is the most HOA thing I have ever heard." It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of petty enforcement and the importance of practical thinking over aesthetic concerns. I settled into my role on the board, discovering that I actually enjoyed the work when it was focused on genuine community improvement rather than nitpicking enforcement. We updated playground equipment, negotiated better snow removal contracts, and organized neighborhood events that brought people together. Susan remained president, but she had evolved into a more collaborative leader, actually listening to input rather than dictating decisions. One warm evening in July, I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the mountains pink and gold. My propane tanks were visible from where I sat, and I felt a strange affection for them. They were just utility equipment, simple cylinders of fuel, but they had become symbols of something larger. The importance of standing up for what was right, the value of preparation, the power of helping others, and the possibility of change. Gary walked by walking his dog and veered up my driveway. "Evening, Ryan. Beautiful night. It really is. I was just telling Linda about the propane tank thing. She says we should write it up and submit it to one of those community management magazines as a case study." I think enough people have heard that story. Maybe. But it is a good story. David versus Goliath, HOA edition. Plus, it has a happy ending. Not enough stories have those these days. He had a point. In a world full of conflicts without resolution, problems without solutions, and divisions without bridges, my little propane tank saga had actually turned out well. People had learned, changed, and grown. The community was stronger and better prepared. Relationships had been built that would last years. "You know what the best part is?" Gary continued. "Susan is dating someone, did you hear? Some guy she met at a disaster preparedness conference of all things. She is actually happy, not just busy. You can see it in her face." I smiled. Good for her. Good for all of us. Happy Susan is much easier to deal with than angry Susan. He tugged on his dog's leash. "See you at the board meeting next week. I will be there." As he walked away, I thought about the journey from that first confrontation on my driveway to this peaceful evening. It had been frustrating, exhausting, and at times infuriating. But it had also brought out the best in people when the crisis hit. It had forced difficult conversations, challenged assumptions, and ultimately made the community stronger. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Chen, my attorney. "Saw your neighborhood got mentioned in a Colorado community management article about emergency preparedness. Your propane tanks are famous. Glad I told you not to remove them." I texted back. Best legal advice I ever received. August brought the annual Pinewood Valley community picnic, a tradition that had fallen into disrepair during Susan's most controlling years. We revived it with enthusiasm, renting bounce houses for kids, organizing a softball game, and grilling enough food to feed the entire neighborhood twice over. Susan gave a short speech thanking everyone who had helped during the Thanksgiving storm and officially presenting me with a plaque that read, "Ryan Calloway, community hero, propane tank defender, friend to all who were cold." It was cheesy and embarrassing, and I loved it. Later, as families gathered on blankets to watch the sun set behind the mountains, I reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. The neighborhood felt different now, more connected, less isolated. People knew each other's names, looked out for each other, actually cared about their neighbors' well-being beyond property values. The propane tanks that started it all continued to sit beside my garage, doing their job quietly and efficiently. They had become something of a neighborhood landmark. Visitors would ask about them, and locals would launch into the story with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. One version I heard at the picnic had me single-handedly fighting off the entire HOA board with nothing but a wrench and my righteous anger, which was ridiculous but entertaining. Another version had Susan showing up at my door during the storm begging on her knees for help, which definitely did not happen but made for a dramatic story. The truth was more nuanced, more human, and ultimately more interesting than any exaggerated version. It was about people making mistakes, learning from them, and choosing to be better. It was about preparation meeting opportunity, about standing firm on principle while remaining compassionate, about the complex reality that people could be both frustrating and admirable at the same time. As fall approached again and the aspens began turning gold, I received a call from a journalist at the Denver Post who was writing an article about HOA overreach and wanted to interview me about the propane tank incident. I agreed, figuring if my experience could help other homeowners stand up to unreasonable HOA demands, it was worth sharing. The article ran in late September with the headline, "How One Homeowner's Defiance Saved His Colorado Neighborhood During Winter Storm." It was fair and well written, presenting both my perspective and the HOA's response. Susan was quoted extensively, and I was pleased to see she did not try to downplay the board's initial mistake. She owned it, explaining how the crisis had changed her approach to community management. The article got picked up by several other outlets, and suddenly, my phone was ringing with calls from homeowners across the country dealing with their own HOA nightmares. I became an accidental advocate, offering advice on how to navigate covenant restrictions, when to push back, and how to document everything for potential legal challenges. Some stories were worse than mine. I talked to a veteran in Arizona who was being fined for flying an American flag, a grandmother in Florida facing foreclosure over a paint color dispute, a teacher in Texas being harassed for parking a slightly oversized vehicle in her own driveway. The common thread was HOA boards drunk on their own authority, more concerned with control than community. I connected many of these people with Marcus Chen and other attorneys who specialized in HOA law. Some fought and won, some negotiated settlements. A few sold their homes and moved to neighborhoods without HOAs. Each situation was unique, but they all reinforced my belief that these organizations needed better oversight and accountability. In October, I was invited to speak at a state legislative hearing on HOA reform. I testified about my experience, emphasizing the need for reasonable limits on HOA authority, clearer processes for homeowner appeals, and mandatory training for board members on their legal responsibilities. My testimony was just one of many, but the committee seemed genuinely interested in addressing the issue. Back in Pinewood Valley, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The board was functioning well. Susan had found a better balance between structure and flexibility, and the neighborhood felt like an actual community rather than a collection of houses bound by restrictive covenants. The first snow of the season arrived in mid-November, a light dusting that coated everything in white but melted by afternoon. It was nothing like the monster storm from the previous year, but it prompted conversations and memories. People checked their emergency supplies, made sure their heating systems were functioning, and looked at my propane tanks with a new appreciation. At the November board meeting, we reviewed the Emergency Preparedness Committee's first-year report. The results were impressive. 40% of households had created emergency kits. 15% had installed alternative heating or power sources. And the neighborhood database had over 100 residents registered with skills or resources they were willing to share during a crisis. "This is what community is supposed to look like," Donald said, reviewing the numbers. "People prepared and willing to help each other." Susan nodded. "We lost sight of that for a while." We were so focused on rules and enforcement that we forgot the point was to create a place where people wanted to live and felt safe. Ryan, I know you have been here for just over 2 years now, but you have done more to build actual community than I did in my first 5 years as president. Thank you. It was a gracious statement and I appreciated it. It was not just me. It took a crisis to bring everyone together, but once people saw what was possible, they embraced it. That is not me. That is everyone choosing to be better neighbors. The meeting wrapped up, and as I was packing up my notes, Patricia approached me. She had been the most hostile board member during the propane tank dispute, and we had maintained a cordial but distant relationship since. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I was terrible to you during that whole propane situation. I went along with Susan because I was afraid of being on her bad side. That was cowardly, and it almost had serious consequences. I am sorry. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot. For what it is worth, you have changed how I think about my role on this board. It is not about power or control. It is about service. I am trying to keep that in mind now." These moments of accountability and growth were becoming more common, and they gave me hope that lasting change was possible. People were not fixed in their ways. Given the right circumstances and examples, they could evolve. December brought holiday lights, neighborhood parties, and a sense of celebration tinged with relief that we were not facing another historic blizzard. The weather remained relatively mild, with typical Colorado snow that was beautiful without being dangerous. On Christmas Eve, I hosted a gathering at my house for neighbors who did not have family in town. It was a casual affair, potluck style, with no agenda beyond enjoying each other's company. About 20 people showed up, including Susan with her new boyfriend, Gerald, who turned out to be funny and kind and clearly good for her. As midnight approached and people began heading home, Susan lingered behind to help clean up. "You did not have to stay," I said, washing dishes while she dried. "I wanted to. This was lovely, Ryan. The kind of neighborhood event I always imagined but never quite managed to create. You were trying too hard. Sometimes you just have to get out of the way and let things happen organically." "Sage advice from the propane tank guy," she smiled. "That is going to be your epitaph, you know. Here lies Ryan Calloway. He had propane tanks and was not afraid to use them." I laughed. "There are worse legacies." We finished the dishes in comfortable silence, a far cry from our contentious beginnings. As she was leaving, she turned back at the door. "I am stepping down as HOA president at the end of my term in March. I have been doing it for 8 years, and it is time for fresh leadership. I am going to recommend you as my successor." I nearly dropped the towel I was holding. "What, Susan, I have only been on the board for less than a year. And in that time, you have done more good than I did in 8. You understand what leadership actually means. You put people before rules, community before control. The neighborhood trusts you. Think about it, okay?" She left before I could protest further, and I stood in my doorway watching the Christmas lights twinkle in the cold air, wondering if I was ready for that kind of responsibility. January brought the anniversary of the storm, and a neighborhood gathering to commemorate what people had started calling the Great Freeze. It was a celebration of how we had all come together, pulled through, and emerged stronger. There were speeches, stories, and even a photo slideshow documenting the event. At the gathering, several neighbors stood up to share what the experience had meant to them. Linda talked about the importance of community resilience. Gary discussed the technical lessons about infrastructure vulnerability. Martha, the elderly woman who had held her husband's hand throughout the crisis, simply said, "I learned that our neighborhood is full of heroes. Some of them just look like regular people with propane tanks." That got a huge laugh and started a standing ovation that embarrassed me thoroughly. In February, I gave my answer to Susan's proposal. Yes, I would run for HOA president. It felt right, like a natural progression of the journey that had started with that first contentious confrontation over utility equipment. The election was in March, and to my surprise, I ran unopposed. The board voted me in unanimously, and I became the president of the Pinewood Valley Homeowners Association, the organization that had once threatened to fine me into oblivion for keeping my house warm. My first act as president was to establish new board operating principles. We would prioritize safety over aesthetics, community building over rule enforcement, and transparency over authority. We would admit mistakes quickly, listen more than we talked, and remember that we served the residents, not the other way around. Susan stayed on as an advisory member, providing institutional knowledge without trying to control decisions. It was a good arrangement, letting her contribute without the pressure of leadership. Spring brought new challenges and opportunities. We had water main issues to address, roads that needed repaving, and the eternal battle with prairie dogs that kept digging up the common areas. But we also planned a community garden, organized neighborhood watch programs that actually fostered connection rather than suspicion, and started a welcome committee for new residents. My propane tanks remained a fixture beside my garage, no longer controversial but iconic. They appeared in the neighborhood newsletter with a historical marker-style caption, "The tanks that saved Pinewood Valley." It was melodramatic, but the sentiment was genuine. One warm evening in April, I sat on my porch with a beer, watching kids play in the street and neighbors chatting over fences. This was what I had wanted when I moved here. A place to rebuild my life, to be part of a community, to have a home rather than just a house. The journey had been far more complicated than I had expected, full of conflict and frustration and moments when I seriously considered just selling and moving somewhere without an HOA. But pushing through those challenges had led to something better than I could have imagined. I had found not just a place to live, but people who mattered, a community I cared about, and a role that let me make a real difference. My phone rang. It was Marcus Chen. "Hey, Ryan, just wanted to give you a heads up. That case I told you about, the one in Boulder where the HOA was trying to force a homeowner to remove their solar panels. We won. Judge ruled that the HOA overstepped, cited your case as precedent. Your propane tank battle is now case law." I laughed in disbelief. "You are kidding." "Nope. You are officially part of Colorado HOA legal history. Congratulations, you are helping people you will never meet." After we hung up, I sat there processing this information. My stubborn refusal to remove necessary utility equipment had become a legal precedent that would protect other homeowners from similar overreach. It was a strange legacy, but a meaningful one. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The divorce that brought me to Colorado, the house purchase in an HOA-controlled neighborhood, the propane tanks that seemed like a simple practical solution, Susan's violation notice that sparked the conflict, the storm that tested us all, the community that emerged from crisis stronger and more connected. Each piece had been necessary, each challenge a step on a path I could not have predicted but would not change. The propane tanks were still there, still doing their job, still symbolizing the importance of standing firm on principle while remaining open to growth and change. I raised my beer toward them in a silent toast. To propane tanks, unlikely heroes, and the journey from conflict to community. To standing your ground and helping your neighbors. to second chances and people who choose to be better, to home, in every sense of the word. The story of the propane tanks would be told and retold in Pinewood Valley for years to come, each telling adding new details or emphasis. But the core truth remained constant. Sometimes the things that seem most controversial, most inconvenient, most against the rules, turn out to be exactly what saves you. And sometimes the people who oppose you most strongly can become your greatest allies if circumstances force everyone to see beyond their own narrow perspectives. I finished my beer and went inside my warm, comfortable house, grateful for propane tanks, stubborn principles, winter storms, and the complex, frustrating, wonderful reality of community life in suburban Colorado. It had been a hell of a journey, and I would not have traded it for anything.